Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Aaron Schmidt, who is a psychological operations specialist in the United States Army Reserve. Aaron Schmidt, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
John, thanks so much for having me. I'm genuinely excited to be part of the esteemed roster of guests that you've had, and so to even be considered in their stead is a pretty big honor for me. So thanks for having me.
You bet. We're looking forward to having the conversation today, which is going to cover your perspective and experiences with information exercises. But before we get into this, first of all, I'd like to just make sure our audience understands that Aaron's opinions here are his own and don't represent the opinions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. And also, number two, Aaron just reached out to me on the old email and connected up and said, hey, I think I've got some interesting stuff to discuss that would be relevant for the Cognitive Crucible Forum. And just said, what do you think? And I said, yeah, sure, let's do it. So the point I'm making here is we do have a pitch process. And so to our audience again, if you have something that you'd like to contribute to this forum, please go to our website, information-professionals.org, and go to the podcast page, and there you will find information on how you can submit your podcast pitch, and we'll review it and get back to you. So thanks, Aaron, for reaching out. And could we start, please, by getting your overall comment on our strategic landscape or the times in which we live?
Right. Well, I mean, it's certainly a large, daunting, and multifaceted ask, right, when it comes to the formation of or the information environment and operations in it. But I start with the overall assessment that we as practitioners need to have the appropriate amount of humility in the face of those large and daunting and multifaceted tasks. I'm sure over the course of our conversation, I'm going to sound a little cynical, but I promise I'm not. Some of the early evidence of that is my resolute belief that we have some of the most intelligent and capable professionals in the information space. But the fact remains that our approach to that information space is still working through a lot of contradictions, and a lot of them are pretty self-inflicted. And I think the more that we're honest about those contradictions and honest in our roles, honest about our roles in them and in the capabilities and in the face of those contradictions, I think that's when we as an industry can bring to our talent to bear on the challenges. So while I'm certainly not the first to say that we have a long way to go in addressing the information dimension of the strategic landscape, what I'm willing to do personally is advocate for humility in the face of it, because I think that's actually also the answer to our challenges. And so, to wit, one more time, I'll say that it's a genuine honor for me to speak with you in the IPA, given that I've learned so much from everybody that you've had on your podcast, and hope to live up to the marker that you put down for the pitch, and hope this continues. But I'm definitely humbled to be anything close to anyone's company that you've had on the podcast. So thank you.
Well, I think here in just a moment, your professional experiences will more than qualify you as a guest in this forum. So with that, could you please just give our audience a little bit more background about your career?
Oh, sure. So in addition to being a psychological operations specialist in the Army Reserve, I'm an educator at heart as well as by trade. I went to undergraduate and graduate school at the University of Virginia, where I honestly wish I would have met a recruiter or anyone in PSYOP, because I would have signed up that day, now that I know how complementary education and PSYOP are. But being young and dumb, I only knew the military through my dad's Air Force service. He was a backseater for the F-4 and the F-15 And that was obviously great exposure as a kid, but it made me pretty myopic to what service could have looked like for me. So I started as an educator in the public school classroom. I taught 7th grade English, and over the course of a decade, worked in roles from elementary education to higher education. And then there's actually some fellow educators, some fellow reservists. So shout out to Jason and Ryan, who told me about their reserve service generally, and then a little bit about PSYOP specifically. And at that point, I was finally smart enough to pursue it. And I've been in PSYOP ever since, and I do it both as a defense contractor and a reservist. And so, we'll echo the fact that my opinions today are my own and don't reflect the DoD, the Army, or my employer.
Right, for sure. So, information exercises. So there's some in our audience. So we've got a mixed audience. There are a lot of national security practitioners in our audience, but there's a lot of people who are not as familiar with the Department of Defense and the kinds of things that DoD personnel do. So could you describe what information exercises are, and then pass along some of your observations about how information exercises are either success, what some of the successes are, and where we might need a little bit of assistance, do you think?
Sure. So kind of along the lines of what you mentioned, to set the table for everything else, when I use the term exercise, I am talking about it in a military context, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners are aware of, but it also applies, as mentioned, back to an educational perspective that I always try to bring to everything. So, to put a button on it, quote, to put a definition, it would be a culminating and collective event carried out for the purpose of training and evaluation. So while we'll talk about it in a military context, that applies, again, that's a pretty blanket term. But adding the information dimension to that, baseline, familiar, or even standard definition, that's why I'm excited to talk to you today, because, the complexity added in doing that is such a big challenge, and therefore a huge opportunity for information professionals. So my assertion today is going to be that adding the quote unquote information environment to an exercise is just way more difficult than we even currently assess. And that we as information professionals need some of that aforementioned humility to take up the challenge. So I'm arguing for that any governmental organization, whether it's an agency, military branch, anyone dealing with that information operations in the information environment challenge, any exercise, again, a culminating training event that has a quote unquote information environment already has to face pretty distinct contradictions. And if you're going to face those, at the very least, make some assumptions for its training audience in order to actually produce that quote unquote information environment. And so, as you mentioned, for the Army specifically, I can speak to that one. And I would certainly say that there are 3 big contradictions. And that's kind of what I wanted to lead off with. First and foremost, that an information environment, when we put that in quotes, requires a big S state level resource. But first problem is there are none, or there isn't one, right? 2, joint operations in the information environment, by nature, those demand joint level cooperation all the time. So no matter what echelon, the joint operations in the information environment demand joint level cooperation. And then finally, while terminology is definitely a problem across operations in quote information, one of the biggest for branches of the DoD is that information is not a warfighting function across all of its branches. So those are the kind of the 3 problems as I would lay them out. And I'll probably do this over the course of our conversation. I'll quote a couple of your episodes. There are definitely a few I know by number because I recommend them so often. And this is a great place to lead off. And that's number 49 with Matt Armstrong. Personally, I'd say just pause whatever I'm saying and go listen to his episode, because that discussion was absolutely foundational for my understanding of a lot of the things I'm talking about. But with apologies to Matt, I'll take the NCO shot at walking down the first contradiction that I outlined there. And that is the dime contradiction, which, again, copy paste Matt for the real insight. But the long and short of it is that there is no actual co-equal instrument for the I and the dime model. And that's at least nominally since 1999 with USAIA's disappearance. So that contradiction means that the diplomatic, military, and economic instruments, though there are those, are all responsible for information effects. And to borrow a football maxim, if you've got 2 quarterbacks, you've got no quarterback. And in this case, we have 3. So even if you set aside the limits of the model, which how can you, for example, conduct diplomacy without information? And we'll set that one aside for a moment. I'm starting all the way up at the instruments of national power, because if a Marine exercise, for example, has a quote unquote information environment, then that exercise notionally has a big S state level consideration to contend with. It's right there in the model that we've all come to know, and some of us have come to loathe, right? That's not to say every service level exercise needs state level resources, but every service level exercise knows its place in the hierarchy. So it just so happens that quote information is a state level resource. So when you create an exercise, or again, a culminating and collective event carried out for the purposes of training and evaluation, needing the resources of an instrument that doesn't exist, that's the first contradiction.
Do you think, Aaron, we could just like linger on that for just a moment? So
Sure.
I want to make sure that I heard you right. You're asserting that there's no co-equal national power instrument for the I in DIME, diplomatic, information, military, and economic instruments of power. Now, I mean, do you attribute that to what do you attribute that to? Well, because the Department of State should probably be where that kind of a capability resides. Would you generally agree?
I would definitely not assert any expertise in that, which is why I kind of defer to Matt's expertise, right? But if we were just to assign or at least agree upon who, like I said in that maxim, quarterbacks the effort, right? The D in diplomacy, that would be your state, right? So I mean, at least from my understanding. And so then for the military, you have the DoD, and for the economic, even if you wanted to reduce it to, or sorry, not reduce it to, but leave it exclusively to Department of Treasury, there is somebody who would either nominally, notionally, by agency, have that quarterbacking mentality to those efforts. And so, I think Matt's point, from what I understand, and I would again defer any listener to it, that while the government thinks in resources, and so you build the resource and then kind of go after the effect, information creates a complex problem where we need to know the effect we need that the effect needs to drive the primacy of our effort. And in a government model where we say, okay, we create the resources that will then create the effects, that's a big problem for information, because again, even if you were to say that USIA had at some point the ability to quote unquote quarterback that effort, which I don't know that anyone would agree to, the fact that it's not there anymore is the first big problem, right? That where is that state level resource, big S state, if I am subordinate to that effort and I need to go get that level of resources, I'm literally going to ask the absence of a resource.
I see. Yeah, and something else that I've heard Matt say a number of times, I'm certain that he says it in that episode that you called out there, Aaron, but he has a nifty like chart where he shows how there's a key position within the influence structure of the Department of State, and this key position has been vacant for like, I don't know, like out of the last 10 years, like there's only been a handful of months where there's been somebody within this position, and he points to that as a big blinking problem.
And to underscore that effects point, the thing that he brings up, and I always go back to it with any of my junior soldiers or anybody who will listen to a rant, that PEC-P model, or the model of effects as opposed to resources, which the Army War College identified back in I think it was 1919. The fact that a model that was driving for the effects of state power as opposed to their resources, and that was the political, economic. I'm trying to remember. Combat was the C, and then the then the co-equal psychologic effects that the state should be pursuing, and how we've kind of got away from that. And again, I'm going to leave all that to Matt's episode, but it was one of those things that always sticks with me, because thinking in effects is one of the things that I think we as PSYOP professionals, certainly, information operations professionals broadly, we need to be thinking in effects, but the model that we kind of need to defer to is all built around resources, and one of those resources is missing. So again, I can't say it any better than Matt, and he definitely radicalized me as it comes to this. Like, if you've ever caught the end of my dime rant, from somebody who's talked to me, it's all his fault. But again, just really fundamental understanding that the model speaks in resources where we need to be thinking of effects. And if I'm thinking of effects and need to know those resources, the big one that I should have, that touch point, I don't have at the state level, big S state level.
I see. Okay, I think I got you sidetracked there a little bit. So please continue.
Yeah, no. So just kind of drop it down one level. So going, from the state, big S state, down to even to delve into that M, right, in the military. So because of this phenomenon that Rosa Brooks calls in a book of the same name, the militarization of everything, which we've experienced over the last decades, ensures the DoD is going to try to own it, right? So as the joint force, we can at least move past that first contradiction for the time being and say, okay, well, the DoD is going to take ownership of it. And even if it isn't exclusive, we can focus on our information operations. And therefore, as we're talking about exercises, an exercise with a quote unquote information environment. And this is where I'll explain those severe air quotes I've been putting on the term information environment, because joint doctrine has now claimed that term. That's a no kidding joint level thing, right? So as an exercise planner or even an operations in the environment practitioner, that's an assumption made for me. So that's good. That addresses the first contradiction. But now at the joint level, doctrine actually adds another contradiction as an NCO, as I read it, right? I can count on doctrine to get me out of the hard thinking, and that's nice as an NCO. Just give me the reference and I'll execute. But sourcing some of these quotes I'm about to reference, I actually end up getting mired in more contradiction. And a little axe to grind. Like, you can't even find JP 304 information in joint operations. That's not even on the Joint Operations Series website. You kind of have to know that you're looking for it, go to the joint doctrine hierarchy chart, and then click on it. So anyway, I say that to kind of reflect the current state of things, right? But JP 304 says that DoD, quote, in coordination with other United States governments, departments, and agencies, supports the informational instrument of national power, unquote. So not only does the aforementioned instrument not even exist, but military by doctrine cannot do that thing that doesn't exist alone. So that's as it should be, right? Like, we shouldn't be doing anything alone, but that first JP 304 quote actually contradicts JP 1, the capstone document, which says that the U.S. Armed Forces fill unique roles, unquote, right? So not in this case. Like, we don't fill a unique role because we're doing it with this non-existent partner. But you could say I'm being a stickler on the wording there, but A, isn't that the point of doctrine? And B, don't worry, I've still got some more evidence. So to spare a little time, I'll just say that there's an entire other joint pub on interorganizational cooperation. But that very cooperation is also by doctrine part of information and joint operations. So it's separate, but it's not separate, and it's separate, right? So that it's just a little weird. And to underscore that weirdness, the often compared warfighting function of fires, like, if you're in fires, you can at least focus on your mandate from their joint pub to just, quote, integrate and synchronize joint fire support in time, space, and purpose to increase the effectiveness of the joint force, because their doctrine itself, quote, informs interagency and multinational partners, right? So interagency partners can look at fires doctrine to know what joint fires is up to. Information, though, is this weird Ouroboros, right? It's force-fed its own tale of interagency partnership. I think anyone would concur that operations in the, quote, information environment, it demands partnerships. I think we'd all agree, but we're forced back up to that contradiction we tried to get away from by going a level down, and we're being tasked with partnering with a non-existent partner. So even if we drop it down to the DoD perspective, we face that contradiction that nothing regarding the, quote, information environment can solely be a DoD perspective. So we can't own it anymore. The contradiction has followed us down a level. So I'm saying all this because for an exercise environment, we have to now not only make some assumptions about that resource gap, but then also the partnership gap of the partners that we don't have.
I see. And so how does this challenge, I guess. How does this manifest itself as you are, going through an exercise, or
Right.
as you are, you know, getting evaluated, as
Right.
you are saying, the purpose of an exercise is. How does this affect all of that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and for that, I just want to make sure that I address that like third level of contradiction that I mentioned, only because I think it will start to get at it, and then I know I'll put I'll make sure to underscore it, because bringing it down to that branch level. So if I'm in an Army exercise, you'd hope that it gets you out of some contradictions, but of course it doesn't, right? So first and foremost, the Army is the only branch that doesn't designate information as a warfighting function. So if we give ourselves some answers to that state and joint contradiction, what does interoperability look like between a war-fighting function and a non-war-fighting function, much less in an exercise, right? Or a quote-unquote information environment in which we're going to then train and evaluate. But again, let's bring it down to the Army level. I'll get my NCO arms around it and say, okay, well, what is information? Well, the Army, in a new draft pub that tells me that, quote, it's fundamental to command and control, unquote, and also, quote, the building block for intelligence, unquote. So therefore, information is a central part of two, if not all, warfighting functions, since ADP 3.0 says that commanders apply combat power through the warfighting functions using leadership and information. So I mention all of that because with those definitions, every exercise should be an information exercise in the same way that every exercise is or should be a leadership exercise. So while that helps me underscore the importance of information, I would ask, how exactly can you create a quote unquote information environment to exercise operations in that environment for information forces? Because if information is co-equal with leadership, do Army exercises have a leadership environment in which you would exercise leadership? If you have information forces, do you have leadership forces? And if not, why not? And so I'll apologize there for spiraling a bit, but because I'll readily admit that I may just not be understanding what doctrine's laying out for me. I have some of that humility that I'm advocating for, but I'd also assert that it isn't hard to get my arms around doctrine for other warfighting functions as an extreme non-expert in any of those. So before we even get into exercises, I'm trying to assert that until we reckon with those contradictions, or at least answer them, to your point, temporarily at a scale for a given training audience, whatever it is, in order to provide those right start state conditions, we're kind of making ourselves feel better about having exercises that have quote unquote information environments, by using that ambiguity that we've created in our own doctrine. And to underscore that whole point, I'm going to close this little aside by focusing on the joint definition of an information environment, which I think underscores the complexity that I'm talking about, better than anything. So again, the joint definition is, quote, the aggregate of social, cultural, linguistic, psychological, technical, and physical factors that affect how humans and automated systems derive meaning from, act upon, and are impacted by information, including the individuals, organizations, and systems that collect, process, disseminate, or use information. So I would say unequivocally that is something that requires a big S state level resource. So I think what the message today is that we should have the humility to simply state how seldom, and sometimes if at all, our exercises have these quote unquote information environments, and be honest about the justifiable limitations on exercises, whether that's matching objectives to resources, setting out those objectives, et cetera. And I actually just listened to your episode, number 153, with Drs. Berger and Whiskeyman on the importance of OIE resources. And I'd say that I want to echo that message here from an exercise perspective. We can't have all the resources, everyone can't have all the resources. And if we're not going to allocate or reallocate resources, everyone involved should be really clear about expectations in the face of all of those challenges, contradictions, et cetera.
All right. Well, excellent, Aaron. So I think this brings us to the next thing that you wanted to talk about. And these are some of your observations and experiences related to exercises and information considerations that go into exercises. Could you unpack that a little bit for our audience?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so given everything that we just mentioned, put a fine point on it, to really get into those considerations, I'll just say that I think it's almost dangerous for anything below the joint level to consider that quote unquote information environment. I think that applies for operations generally, but to keep it to exercises specifically, I was a little critical of that draft ADP 313 a second ago, but I'm actually really excited by the Army's development of information advantage doctrine, which makes an attempt at answering some of those contradictions, which is crucial to having an exercise environment, which again, cumulative, collective training and evaluation. So it's a essential gap that they bridge, and does so by asserting the informational considerations of domains as opposed to these large and complex environments. So for an example, as an information force of a land component, I, as a PSYOPer, can focus on the information considerations of the operational environment, and then more acutely the commander's objectives in them, so then I can evaluate how I am providing that information advantage to that consideration. But not to let the ADP off the hook, it then uses information to define information and says that information considerations also include the information dimension. But on the whole, I do think it's really helpful to assert all of that, that information considerations, whether in operations or in exercise, include human, informational, and physical aspects. So when I'm in pursuit of information advantage, it's framed in a couple terms that I can get my arms around and then be evaluated on. And those three are situational understanding. How am I helping generate an advantage in that regard? Decision-making for a commander, and then relevant actor behavior. So at the very least, the Army doctrine does give us that answer of the who is exercised or operating when it comes to quote unquote information. And in this case, in the exercise environments, because the answer is everyone, right? So that's the good news. But even then, the question of what information considerations entails that's incredibly hard. And I think the best way to underscore the difficulty of it is to compare it to the weather, right? The weather is one of those variables of mission planning that we all consider elemental. It's listed right there in MET-TC, or mission, enemy, terrain and weather, troops, time, and civil considerations. So at any given time, in any exercise or operation, anyone and everyone is responsible for the weather. Now, we're not responsible for the weather, but instead how it affects what everyone is planning at any given time. It's not anyone's job to quote unquote monitor the weather, but it's everyone's job to recognize that elemental impact it has on mission planning. And moreover, I can evaluate that in an exercise setting. So the benefit, therefore, of locating exercises in different places, or in other words, changing that terrain and weather variable, is you expose planners to variation in that particular variable, right? So I'd argue that it's easier to change any other MET-TC variable in any given exercise because of the assumption you can give to planners or conditions that you can simulate for them, right? So you can make more complex missions with additional time constraints and force structures. And even, to get at civilian considerations, you can change risk to miss assessments and ROE changes, right? And the reason I feel pretty confident about this argument is that there are training centers across the world, right? They're in different terrain, weather environments, because everyone recognizes the value in that variation of that T variable, right? And the fact that there are some things you cannot simulate. And so I'd be willing to argue with anyone that informational considerations, at the very least, are no less complex than weather and terrain, and just as varied as the multitude of terrains where we bring those planners to execute, right? And that's the reason I choose this weather for comparison, is that even in a simplified or simulated environment during something like a planning or a command post exercise, we're fortunate that we have the technological means to simulate this variable, at least get at it, right? We can pick up the planner's mission and drop them onto a new digital sand table on a new terrain, whether that's generated or real world. And we have the ability to toggle meteorological conditions with authentic modeling, which is kind of nuts when you think about it, right? All these solutions let professionals who specialize these considerations, they still let them analyze, right? So the level of complexity required to simulate informational consideration is beyond any of those other variables, to include the most complex of them. So while on the one hand, it's great that the Army is asserting information is elemental as far as a consideration, they're actually adding it on to the MET-TC mnemonic. to exercise that takes not only the recognition of that place among those variables, but then the resources to simulate it. So, because while you can move the exercise into different terrains and different weathers analogous to the conditions where our mission sets might exist, right? Like we saw CTCs move to reflect the environments of Iraq, Afghanistan, we will always have to simulate and model the information consideration. Because if we're moving a mission to an environment with the same or even analogous information considerations, not an exercise anymore, but that's a mission. You know what I mean? It's on the conflict continuum at the very least. We can't simulate those motivations and everything of people who are, you know, under threat of violence or under existential threat, right? So you can't simulate the sum total of systems that exceed the complexity of weather patterns, right? That's kind of the thing I'm trying to underscore. And so I would argue, therefore, that the most resources in an exercise should be dedicated to that consideration for any exercise, because we absolutely have to reckon with that environment, without those considerations of the operational environment. So this is where I'm calling for that humility, right? Not just to recognize where we have the resources, where we don't have the resources, and know how incredible that challenge is, even with something approaching, you know, requisite resources. And you know, to be fair, I've seen incredible efforts made toward creating events that exercise that informational consideration. Like, one of the things that I'm always astounded that people don't use more is the DATE, or the decisive action training environment. That's a website that that Army TRADOC puts out that outlines an incredible amount of simulated exercise environments. But even in the face of the incredible quality of those documents that do so much to flesh out the operational environment variables, there is so much more to exercise that environments that either have to create or consider to responsibly simulate that information consideration. And so, another episode reference, I'll turn to your chat with Major Cassandra Brooker, and I know that one's episode 81, in her discussion of the effectiveness of influence activities in information warfare. I cannot overstate how formative that discussion was for me, cannot recommend it highly enough. So I'll leave the actual insight to her and her work. I will be so bold as to say that anyone who has heard the term in a military context or otherwise, PMESII-PT, needs to check out that work on her systems, on her work on systems analysis, because the Army really led us astray with the late additions to that mnemonic. And it
I'm sorry, Aaron. What was that acronym that you just used?
Yep. Yeah, it's PMESII-PT. And so that was a mnemonic that the Army put out in order to address the operational variables of the environment. And that was, again, political, military, economic, social, information, which there's information again, right, and infrastructure. And then so it's not my argument that the PT or the mnemonic led us astray. I defer to one of its authors. There's a Mr. Mark DeMike. In an interview, he underscored how the PT that were added onto that mnemonic of the physical and the time, those are not systems that the other 6 variables are, but those are effects on systems. So in kind of typical Army fashion, we got our wires crossed, and you know, and people started basically mixing the mnemonic there, right? And so I underscore that because, you know, Major Brooker's work gets at a deliberate approach to systems analysis of those 6 variables that then let us start to think about the effects on systems, and then those effects as variables on an operations environment. And you could even do something that a little bit simpler or a little bit more known to our civil affairs brethren, where they use a scope, or they take into consideration the areas, structures, capabilities, organizations, people, and events of those 6 variables in the OE, right? So whatever deliberate approach you take, whether it's Major Brooker's, whether it's something like an A-scope model, just to have the humility, you know, to recognize the complexity of the problem, whether that's an operation or an exercise. And so, you know, to pull it back to that exercise, just the humility that's required to step back from the environment and say, what environment exists that not only places a demand for information considerations onto planners that met TCI variable, but then also lets them produce effects, right? So the easiest thing to do to evaluate progress toward that environment is go right to an exercise's measles or the master scenario events list. And to the force's credit, well, no matter where it is, I've seen a lot more considerations, information variable considerations in the measles, whether that's theater, Army Brigade, Marine Division, Expeditionary Force, whatever. I've seen it a lot more. But the unfortunate part is those are capability considerations. So forces can be forced to consider that information part of it, but there's no pathway for them to have effects either in shaping actions or follow-on with consideration. So, to phrase it diplomatically, information forces are shouting into the wind. And I'll use a recent anecdote from a CTC or a combat training center where there was a rotational training unit or an RTU thought they had done a great job of this quote unquote monitoring their information environment. But the adversary was convinced otherwise because they put out a tweet that said, well, the Army killed civilians, and then, quote, no one did anything about it. But when you put these two perspectives in a room, it became very clear that neither of them had a true sense of how they themselves would meaningfully affect the play of the exercise, right? Because there really wasn't a path to do so. Nothing in the exercise materially changed because of this quote unquote incident. And I would even say both of them were correct in their own frames of reference because they got some measure of feedback that validated their assumption, but those sources of feedback were kind of independent of each other, right? And that goes all the way back to that first discussion of the quote unquote information environment. Did the exercise really produce a big S state level or joint level? Because remember, that's where where the information environment lives now, where these forces could exercise or be trained and evaluated. I'd say they didn't even create an environment to be observed meaningfully if the baselines were so mismatched. So again, at least with the weather or the terrain, you can pull real-time ground truth, right? Because even if you're in a simulated environment, no one has to create those. Like ex-con, friendly, and adversarial forces, they can all look at analysis on ground truth because those are governed by physics and even complex mathematical models. That ground truth exists independent of everyone involved in the exercise. So while we all recognize that the information environment is incredibly complex, we just too often don't have the humility to recognize that creating an information environment proper it's just a massive undertaking, right? Massive, even before the training audience gets there. And that's where you get that notorious IO sprinkle, right? And this is where I'll turn to my analogy, and I'll shout out the Sergeant Major Avery Bennett, and he calls it the IO salsa of the operational burrito, right? The salsa belongs in the burrito. So you can do a lot of work on great salsa. You can improve it, make it complementary to flavors, and for our discussion, even test your line cooks, right, on their ability to make salsa. But if you're not requiring it as an ingredient where you'll stop, unwrap the burrito before you send it out to the customer, is not part of the recipe, right? So if your exercise at some point can't unwrap because of the effects in the information dimension or information considerations of your operation, however you want to frame it, you're not conducting an information exercise. And there again is the humility, right? To know even if it's not a good answer, it's the right answer. And I say that because, of course, every exercise doesn't unwrap because every warfighting function input at every point, right? Not everyone can stop the exercise at any given moment. But what I can promise you are that for exercises, there are actual unwrap inflection points for other warfighting functions. And so we need that humility again to recognize that information for all the purported importance that we're giving it, it's not yet an unwrap the burrito ingredient. And that's what, and I'll just speak to exercises in this moment, right? And admitting that, that's what allows us to honestly, meaningfully set conditions in order to create a true information exercise.
Wow, that's a lot of stuff, Aaron. And I mean, you've got a lived experience here, which you're obviously very passionate about. I'm curious. Have you been to an exercise relatively recently at the Army's National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California, number one, and number two, we did a episode with Lieutenant Colonel Brian Burbank, who is I believe he's the operations officer out there, but he describes a environment where the Army is very explicitly creating a exercise environment which is relevant for today's battlefield, with information effects or information rounds coming in to the deployed brigade, and et cetera, et cetera. What observations do you have there?
Yeah, so that was definitely one of the positive notes that I wanted to highlight, and the reason that I want to highlight it as such a success as an exercise is because of the scope and scale. So I've kind of laid out these giant CTC level rotation exercises that may or may not have a big S state level resource for an information environment, but the success that I saw was because those were reduced in scope and scale. So, for example, I'll bring it back to my lived experience with that. My last CTC actually was out at NTC, and we were assigned to a multifunction team, or an MFT. So my PSYOP unit was with Civil Affairs, CEMA, or Cyber-Electric Magnetic, basically the Army's electromagnetic abbreviation, Public Affairs, so PAO, a legal team, and then a unit ministry team. So it was actually a half dozen chaplains. And we were assigned together, but we were assigned to a simulated town for 4 days. So that MFT took up everything that it could at its disposal, had some simulated permissions, authorities, resources, and had a task with ensuring the stability of this little AO, right? So able to conduct analysis, create plans, execute operations. You work as a whole, right, comprised of this unique combination of skill sets. So while I think stability ops is now getting a little bit of a dirty word, bad word reputation, the experience was so beneficial because of that scope and scale, right? So it was not part of that larger CTC. So if we're in the box for 28 days, then the back 4 is what I was talking about. And yes, the AO was scoped to, a town that was more a village, and you had the ability to do all that with the resources you brought to bear. But it made crucial assumptions, assertions, however you want to get at those lines that it drew for the training audience to say, this is where you're going to live. This is the scope that you have, and we're going to scope the problem down for you. Approach the complexity because we have that level of control. So it's a lived example of the things that I'm talking about, because it answered some of those contradictions, understood where it could and could not live, and that's to the benefit of the exercised or exercising force that's out there, and has that requisite humility to say this is who it's for. Now, because the problem that I'm highlighting is when we say broadly that this CTC or this exercise is a good job of a quote unquote information environment, my argument would be it's the scope and scale that's going to make it successful for that actual interplay, that actual evaluation in something that is approaching the complexity of what we would call quote unquote an information environment.
All right. Wow. Okay. Excellent perspective. Do you have anything else that you want to touch on before we start moving into lightning round and closing out?
Yeah. So I think the good news is that there's a simple but hard fix, right? So if you have a quad chart with 2 axes, like one's easy, hard, and then the other one's complex and simple, this is a simple fix but a hard fix, right? So for the information environment, or even considerations of the OE, we just have to define accurately those objectives and resources. So I take that all the way back to the 7th grade classroom, right, where I learned my greatest life lessons. If you put more than 7 people in a room, for example, they all turn into 7th graders. So that, no matter the age, that's been a huge part of my success professionally, whether NCO, educator, or whatever, but also as an exercise planner, right? If I set objectives for my students, soldiers, or training audience, and I don't provide them with the right resources to meet that objective, then I, the educator, the leader, the planner, have failed, right? So this is where the things that I've been talking about come together. In the exercise environment, does the training audience really have the resources to demonstrate capabilities and effects, right? Is there really an information environment that lives independent of the training and adversary force? So something that you've planned and tested, does it take inputs and outputs even absent the training audience, right? Is there a way that you've thought about how what would the white arrow do if it weren't for the red and blue arrow, right? Again, that's why the exercise exists, is training and evaluation. So if I'm going to meaningfully evaluate my information forces, is there that ground truth pathway for their effects? How have you answered, again, even with assumptions, guardrail conditions, scale and scope, those contradictions, or what informational considerations have you responsibly modeled that face all of that aforementioned complexity to give it to the training audience, right? So that I think is one of those things that we can really start to level, is simply defining the resources objectives that we have to match those up. So to go back to cyber electromagnetic activities, or CEMA, right? One of the things that my mind always goes back to, there's one place that I know of, there's a cyber range in Muscatatuck, Indiana. And if you're not familiar, I highly recommend looking into it. The episode that I know of, there's one on the Modern War Institute. It's from years ago, which I know is an eternity in tech terms, but it's a great introduction to that training area, which, long story short, city-sized range that allows CEMA professionals to really exercise capabilities and effects, right? So they have, no kidding, very narrow example that would provide, they can actually shut down a water processing plant, right? The reason that matters is because that's the ground truth concept that I was talking about.
As part of the exercise, they can shut down.
Right. Yeah. So they have all of those resources to go onto this. Like, I'm pretty sure city size. So kind of moving like town plus to small city, where you have the ability to affect the operations of a living, breathing, for lack of a better term, environment. So again, you have that ground truth, right? If the CEMA planners say, hey, we plan to stop the water flow, for example, because it's a living physical system, just one part of informational considerations, by the way, that at least exists outside outside of those force capabilities. And so if everyone turns and sees the water still flowing, there's no debate anymore, right? Your desired effect, you did not achieve your desired effect, right? So to bring it all back to that complexity, that's when you start having those simulations of effects in the human and information dimensions, right? So I didn't want to close on a little bit of a sour note, but I will bring it up to it, and I think that it really kind of underscores that humility that I'm talking about. The Information Operations Networks, or ION. I think you've discussed it a couple times on podcasts, but that's the intranet with the emulators for Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, internet, etc.
No. That's sounding completely new.
I actually thought it was spoken about in that NTC version, but I'll back up a little bit then. But so TRADOC, in that in the same resources that provide the date or that decisive action training environment, they have what is basically a simulated internet, or an intranet.
Okay. Yeah. Brian
Yes.
might have mentioned that.
I'm pretty sure he did, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I bring that up because I'll turn to their own their FAQ to say what its mission statement was, and really kind of unwind that complexity again, right? So we've got this great resource that is, quote, during the hundreds of individual and collective exercises that the Operational Environment Center participated in, it became apparent that the publicly available information variable of the OE was not being replicated. So for this reason, the OEC created ION in 2014. So that mission statement is great because it says, hey, we were not doing a good job of representing the PAI variable. We wanted to get that out there. But the problem that happens today is that if you ask users at exercises, I've heard this before multiple times, you get, quote, that it simulates the information environment. So if I've done even a decent job of framing my entire problem, the alarm bells are ringing, hopefully, right? The resource has been forced into serving as the objective. The tool is the answer. And that's not what it's meant to be, right? And again, that's not my opinion. I've been told this on every occasion that ION's part of the exercises. Planners and participants say, well, we're turning on ION, like that's doing something, right? But that's like saying we're turning on the weather for this exercise, but what they're actually doing is turning on the radar, right? That's a huge incongruity between objectives and resources. So yes, there are tools. Yes, there are some agreed upon weather events, but the level of work that would be necessary to create a weather system to serve as that ground truth would be staggering, right? Mm-hmm. And then if you were to then say, hey, as a planner, I want to know what the weather is, and then someone turns to you and says radar. That is not that's not the answer, right? That's like saying the radar is on, but I don't know, I haven't modeled that, what that's going on. So if I extend the metaphor, being that planner responsible, imagine the number of assumptions that I have to make if I just get told radar, right? So I just want to highlighting, that distinction between objective and resources, leveraging the correct amount and type of resources for the objective that we're setting forth for the training audience. That's the simple but hard thing to do.
Right.
Try to do a lot to describe a lot of challenges, and that's why I just kind of come back to humility, just to look at this giant problem of creating a quote unquote information environment, and think back to that definition, and just be okay with the limited ability in the face of it. Not forever, not throw up our hands and say, well, we can't do it, but instead just diagnose the challenge that we face. So if we're just going to admit that we can't recreate the weather, it doesn't mean we stop planning for the weather in our operations. We just look for better solutions to simulate it when and where we can, but then also use the resources that we have to line them up with the objectives that we can attain. So even just to localize it to information professionals, that keeps us out of doing things like quote unquote monitoring the information environment or quote unquote controlling the narrative, because the level of models of the ability to affect things that we'd have to have and the models behind them would just be insane. Reducing the scope and scale offers us the ability to pursue operations on just the informational consideration, right? You can focus on the commander's mission and in an exercise say, you know what, I'm going to focus on relevant actor behavior in such a way that provides meaningful advantage at a time of the commander's choosing, because I've done the work, for example, that they did at NTC to create the social network, maybe with a little bit of logic like Major Brooker system behind it, to know that if an exercise force is going to come, that there is the requisite complexity to offer that to a commander. So it's just about having that humility, because if we lack it, it's just bad reps, right? Bad training repetitions or bad professional reputations, right? So either way. And so that's why I think the point that you brought up, and I'm glad you did, scoping it down to that great 4-day exercise for that multifunction team, again, reduced scope and scale with the requisite amount of complexity that you have for both the objectives and the resources for that training audience.
Okay. Wow. Those are some fantastic observations and suggestions on, ways to make some incremental but meaningful improvement to exercising our forces in a appropriate environment for today's national security needs. Okay, well, how about we go through a quick lightning round, Aaron, and then close out. So lightning round, 30 seconds or so per answer. Sound good?
Sounds
All
good.
right. First lightning round, gaming.
Oh, yeah. Safe to fail environment, right? So as an educator, I'm very partial to any safe to fail environment, because it's where you see learning and development, right? So applied to the information space, that's where I see so much potential in wargaming for the development of the force. I know you've had Sebastian Bay on the podcast, so his insights and resources always available. Also recommend the work that Marine Corps University is doing. But going back to those giant contradictions of an information environment, wargaming offers those boxes literally, right? So in some cases for training audience to get that meaningful start, again, objectives and resources. So more gaming for sure.
Okay, second lightning round, and I'm not sure what made me come up with this, but just the concept of influencers.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So automatically I think of relation to desired behavior. So that's a PSYOP in me, right? So just like the information environment acts that I've been grinding. So to do what? Influencer to do what? If they're an influencer, what behavior are they influencing? Is that a behavior that I want to amplify, mitigate, use, stop? And then can I relate it to the audience along the same lines? Is it an audience that I care about? Should I care about them? Do I need to care about them? So influencer automatically puts me in the mind of relating audience to behavior with them as a conduit. So whether that's as an information professional, educator, NCO, soldier, or even parent, right? Knowing the audience and the desired behavior gives me the best ability to like reckon with that influencer. So in each of my roles that I just outlined, how to contend with an influencer, I should absolutely know how those are going to, affect my objectives in each of those roles.
Right, right. And if I'm being silly about it, everybody is an influencer.
Right.
But the scale of influence might vary depending
Exactly.
on
Yeah.
who
And
you're talking
moreover, not just the scale, but then the strength, right? So, you could have that broad reach with a little bit of affect or very low and all on all different spectra, right? So yes, 100%.
My gosh. Okay, yeah. Last lightning round. 21st century national security talent.
Hmm. 21st century national security talent management.
Sure.
I'll go back to, yeah, that's why I'd go back to my own experience. And then having missed out on serving earlier, and I'll take full ownership for my delay, but it pushes me as an information professional in all my capacities, just remember that there's talent everywhere. Right. And it's just waiting to be leveraged in the face of all these challenges we're talking about. So I like that discussion of the compressed nature of everything in the 21st century. And that means that the strengths and opportunities are that much more exaggerated. So what I mean by that is, yeah, we're fortunate in finding the talent to meet national security challenges. It's limited by our own creativity, but that means it's also limited by our own creativity. So we have to, get out there with the humility that I'm preaching. Say, finding that talent is on us, whether that's, traditional, non-traditional, whatever that looks like or doesn't look like or may not look like to my perception of it. Recruiting and managing people that will take on those informational national security challenges, that's our job, the people who are already in it. So I say that talent management is the way that I'd get at it.
Yeah. All right, great. Well, and let's see, last question. Do you have a book or other online resource that you might recommend to our audience? It may or may not apply to the topic we've been discussing.
Yeah, sure. I think it does, and it was pretty recent. The British Ministry of Defense put out their Influence Wargaming Handbook, and I'd highly recommend it for anyone listening. It's a primer for a lot of the challenges we talked about today. I genuinely appreciated that level-headed approach, multifaceted, information environment. How do you war game things like that? It shows some examples of how they're trying to get at those seemingly intractable problems. And so it doesn't have all the answers, but I think it has a lot of the right questions. And that to me is the space we need to be living in, right? Like if that's not clear by my comments today, that's that humility to have in front of it. And it's not innovative, but doctrine. I mean, the Army is no kidding in the process of rewriting information doctrine as we speak. Not to say that the other joint services are the same. MCDP-8 comes to mind, so everyone's doing it. But I bring that up to challenge fellow soldiers specifically to know the state of their doctrine, right? Have that humility in face of it, especially for information forces, information advantage, et cetera. I think that's just essential. And then, some of the personal things I think as an educator, again, not necessarily that one book recommendation or but how do you bring information to the fiction, to the non-related things that you're reading? How do you look at things through an information operations PSYOP lens? How can you bring yourself to the material and let those be the things that become your next recommendation?
Okay, excellent. Well, and I just looked that up as you were talking about it, Aaron, and that is a online reference that looks like it's open to the world. So you can go and check that out right now without it costing you anything. And so with that, Aaron Schmidt, you've given us a lot to think about, and thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Genuinely, again, my honor, privilege, and hopefully, like I said, hopefully I done a good enough job to keep the pitch open. But I genuinely appreciate the opportunity to hopefully spark some thoughts and get some smarter people on problems that smarter than me. And if I'm always open to more input information, so if the answers are out there, I look forward to seeing them in whatever format those come, whether it's to me personally or published out in the world.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.